Inside United States Penitentiary Atlanta, the prison in the city. There's something unusual about this prison, something you don't notice at first glance. From above, it almost blends into the city. Cars move along nearby roads. Homes sit just blocks away. Businesses operate like nothing is out of place. But then, as you get closer, it becomes impossible to ignore. Concrete walls, reinforced fencing, guard towers watching from every angle. This is United States Penitentiary Atlanta, one of the oldest operating federal prisons in the United States. And unlike most high-security prisons built in isolation, this one was never hidden away. It has existed for more than a century in full view of the public. That decision, intentional or not, has shaped everything about how this prison operates. Because inside those walls is not just a prison population. It's a system under constant pressure. A facility that has witnessed decades of change, in crime, in policy, and in the way incarceration itself is understood. And over time, those pressures have left a mark, not just on the building, but on the people inside it. And to understand what this place is today, you have to go back to the beginning.
Before we dive into today's powerful story, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe for more gripping tales. Your support helps us keep sharing these stories, and we wouldn't want you to miss any of the action. Now, let's get started.
The birth of a federal prison system. At the start of the 20th century, the United States did not have a fully developed federal prison system. Instead, people convicted of federal crimes were often held in state facilities. But that created a problem. The federal government had limited control over how those prisoners were managed. Conditions varied widely. Standards were inconsistent. And accountability was difficult to enforce. So the decision was made to build dedicated federal penitentiaries. Facilities that would operate under centralized authority. Places designed not just to hold inmates, but to define a new standard of incarceration. When USP Atlanta opened in 1902, it became only the second federal penitentiary in the country. Its creation marked a turning point. This wasn't just a building. It was part of a larger shift, a move toward a more structured, more controlled federal correction system. The design reflected the thinking of that era. Large cell blocks arranged for maximum visibility. Long corridors that allowed guards to monitor movement. Heavy steel bars instead of solid doors, emphasizing observation over privacy. The goal wasn't rehabilitation, at least not in the modern sense. It was order, control, and uniformity. But even in those early years, one reality was already taking shape. No matter how carefully a prison is designed, it is ultimately shaped by the people inside it. Inside the original design. The original structure of USP Atlanta followed a model common in early American prisons. Massive cell blocks, open tiers, and a system built around visibility rather than isolation. Cells were small, basic, often shared. There was little in the way of comfort. Lighting was limited. Ventilation was inconsistent. And privacy was almost non-existent. Guards relied on line-of-sight supervision. They walked the tiers, observed behavior, and enforced rules directly. This created a very specific kind of environment, highly controlled, but also highly tense. Because when dozens, sometimes hundreds, of inmates are housed within constant view of one another, every interaction matters. Every conflict is visible, and every moment has the potential to escalate. In theory, this design allowed for order. In practice, it depended heavily on staffing, discipline, and consistency. And when any of those factors weakened, the system became fragile. The city grows around the prison. When USP Atlanta was first built, its surroundings looked very different. The area was far less developed. There was space, distance, a sense of separation from the rest of the city. But that didn't last. As Atlanta expanded throughout the 20th century, the city moved closer. Neighborhoods grew. Roads were built. Businesses opened. And eventually, the prison found itself no longer on the edge of the city, but inside it. Today, it exists as a secured zone within a densely populated area. That creates a dynamic rarely seen in modern high-security facilities. Because most prisons are intentionally placed far from urban centers. Isolation reduces risk, limits outside interference, and provides a buffer during emergencies. USP Atlanta has none of those advantages. Every incident inside carries potential consequences beyond the walls. Emergency responses must be faster. Coordination must be tighter. And any loss of control becomes far more complex. Over the years, this proximity has raised concerns, especially during periods of unrest inside the facility. Because when a prison sits this close to civilian life, the margin for error becomes much smaller. Who was sent here? From its earliest years, USP Atlanta was designed to house federal offenders from across the country. But over time, its population developed distinct characteristics. Unlike many other high-security prisons, Atlanta became known for holding a large number of non-citizen inmates. Many of them were serving sentences for immigration-related offenses. Others were convicted of federal crimes that crossed international lines, including drug trafficking and fraud. At certain points in its history, foreign nationals made up a significant portion of the population. This created a unique internal environment. Multiple languages, different cultural backgrounds, and varying levels of familiarity with the U.S. legal system. According to federal reports, this diversity sometimes introduced challenges. Communication barriers between inmates and staff, tensions between different groups, and difficulties in maintaining consistent order across the population. At the same time, the prison continued to house high-risk offenders, individuals with histories of violence, organized crime connections, or repeat federal convictions. This combination, diversity, complexity, and risk, made USP Atlanta different from many of its counterparts. Not necessarily more dangerous by default, but more unpredictable. Routine, control, and daily life. Inside USP Atlanta, daily life has always been built around routine. Wake-up times are fixed. Movement is controlled. Every action is scheduled. Inmates are assigned to housing units. They follow designated paths, and they are counted multiple times throughout the day. Meals are served at specific hours. Recreation is limited and supervised. Work assignments, when available, are structured and monitored. This system is designed to reduce uncertainty, because in a high-security environment, uncertainty creates risk. But routine alone does not eliminate tension. It only manages it. And when the system becomes strained, whether from overcrowding, staffing shortages, or internal conflict, that routine can begin to break down. Small disruptions become larger problems. Delays lead to frustration, and frustration can quickly escalate, especially in an environment where space is limited and personal freedom is already restricted. The beginning of pressure. By the mid to late 20th century, the U.S. prison system was changing. Crime rates were rising. Federal laws were becoming stricter, and sentencing lengths were increasing. The result was clear. More people were being sent to prison, and they were staying there longer. USP Atlanta, like many facilities at the time, began to feel that pressure. Cells designed for fewer inmates were now holding more. Resources became stretched. Staffing levels struggled to keep pace with population growth, and the balance that once maintained order began to shift. Reports from that period indicate increasing concerns about overcrowding and institutional strain. Not all details are consistently documented across sources, but the overall trend is clear. As the population grew, so did the challenges. And inside a high-security prison, even small increases in pressure can have serious consequences. Because when space becomes limited and control becomes harder to maintain, the environment changes. And once that shift begins, it's difficult to reverse. Pressure, riot, and breakdown. A system stretched to its limit. By the late 1970s and into the 1980s, the warning signs were no longer subtle. The federal prison system was under strain. And inside USP Atlanta, that strain was becoming visible in everyday life. Overcrowding was one of the most consistent concerns raised in official reports during this period. Facilities originally designed for far fewer inmates were now operating beyond their intended capacity. Cells built for 1 or 2 people were sometimes holding more. Common areas became congested. Movement became harder to manage. And with more people came more conflict. But overcrowding alone wasn't the only issue. Staffing levels often did not increase at the same pace as inmate populations. That imbalance meant fewer officers were responsible for supervising more inmates. And in a high-security environment, that changes everything. Because control in a prison is not just about physical barriers. It's about presence, visibility, and the ability to respond quickly when something goes wrong. When that balance shifts, even slightly, the system becomes more fragile. And by the late 1980s, USP Atlanta was operating in a state where that fragility could no longer be ignored. Rising tensions among inmates. As the population grew, so did its complexity. USP Atlanta housed inmates from different countries, backgrounds, and criminal histories. At various points, a large percentage of the population consisted of non-citizens. Many were serving time for immigration-related offenses. Others were connected to international drug trafficking networks. This created an environment where communication was not always straightforward. Language barriers made it harder for staff to manage disputes. Cultural differences sometimes contributed to misunderstandings. And informal group divisions began to form inside the prison. Federal reports and later investigations suggest that these divisions could increase tension, especially when combined with overcrowding and limited supervision. It's important to note that not every interaction led to conflict, but the conditions made conflict more likely, because when people are placed in confined spaces, with limited freedom and constant pressure, even small disagreements can escalate quickly. And inside USP Atlanta, those tensions were building towards something larger, the policy that changed everything. In the late 1980s, a major policy shift began to reshape the inmate population inside USP Atlanta. The United States government increased enforcement of immigration laws. As a result, more non-citizens were being detained and processed through the federal system. And many of them were sent to facilities like Atlanta. At one point, reports indicate that a significant portion, in some estimates, a majority, of inmates at USP Atlanta were foreign nationals. Many were awaiting deportation after serving sentences. Others were in administrative detention related to immigration status. This created a new kind of pressure inside the prison, because these inmates were not all serving the same type of sentence. Some were nearing release but facing deportation. Others were uncertain about their legal status. And that uncertainty added another layer of tension, particularly when policies began to change again. In 1987 and 1988, the U.S. government initiated efforts to deport large numbers of Cuban nationals who had entered the country during the 1980 Mariel boat lift. Many of those individuals had criminal records and were being held in federal custody. But deportation efforts faced complications. Cuba did not consistently accept their return, and that left many detainees in a state of uncertainty. They were being held without a clear timeline for what would happen next. And inside USP Atlanta, that uncertainty became a catalyst. The build-up to the 1987 riot. By 1987, the situation inside USP Atlanta had become increasingly unstable. A large number of Cuban detainees, many from the Mariel boat lift, were being held in the facility. They had been told in some cases that deportation was imminent. But when those deportations stalled, frustration grew. Reports indicate that misinformation and unclear communication contributed to the situation. Some detainees believed they were about to be sent back to Cuba. Others feared indefinite detention. And when expectations clash with reality inside a prison, the results can be unpredictable. According to official accounts, tensions escalated rapidly in November 1987. What began as frustration soon turned into organized resistance, and then into something much larger. The 1987 USP Atlanta riot begins. On November 22, 1987, the situation inside USP Atlanta reached a breaking point. Cuban detainees initiated a large-scale uprising. They took control of parts of the prison. Fires were set, windows were broken, and staff members were taken hostage. The scale of the disturbance was significant. Hundreds of inmates were involved. Large sections of the facility were no longer under staff control. And for a period of time, the prison itself became a contested space. Hostages included correctional officers and other staff. Their safety became an immediate concern. Federal authorities responded quickly. Negotiators were brought in. Law enforcement agencies coordinated efforts from outside the facility. But resolving the situation would take time, because this was no longer a routine disturbance. It was a full-scale prison uprising. Days of negotiation. The standoff did not end quickly. It lasted for several days. During that time, negotiations became the primary focus. Officials worked to communicate with inmate leaders. Their goal was clear: secure the release of hostages, restore order, and avoid further violence. Reports indicate that inmates made specific demands. Many of them were related to deportation policies. They wanted assurances about their future, clarity about their status, and in some cases, guarantees regarding their treatment. Negotiators had to balance those demands carefully. They could not make promises that could not be fulfilled. But they also needed to de-escalate the situation. The presence of hostages made every decision more urgent. Every delay carried risk. And every misstep could have serious consequences. Despite the tension, the situation did not escalate into widespread lethal violence. That outcome was not guaranteed, but through negotiation, a resolution slowly began to take shape. How the riot ended. After several days, the uprising came to an end. Hostages were released. Inmates surrendered control of the facility, and federal authorities re-entered the prison. The resolution was considered by some officials a success, particularly because it avoided a large-scale loss of life. However, that does not mean the situation was without consequences. The prison sustained damage. Operations were disrupted, and the event exposed serious weaknesses in how the facility was being managed at the time. It also raised broader questions about overcrowding, about immigration detention policies, and about the ability of the federal prison system to handle complex populations under pressure. Investigations followed. Reviews were conducted, and changes were proposed. But like many institutional responses, those changes would take time. Aftermath. A prison changed. The 1987 riot marked a turning point in the history of USP Atlanta. It wasn't the first disturbance the prison had experienced, but it was one of the most significant, and its impact extended beyond the facility itself. It influenced how federal authorities approached detention of non-citizens. It highlighted the risks of overcrowding and miscommunication, and it demonstrated how quickly a controlled environment can shift into crisis. In the years that followed, the Bureau of Prisons made adjustments. Some inmates were transferred, policies were reviewed, and efforts were made to prevent similar incidents. But the underlying challenges did not disappear completely, because USP Atlanta was still an aging facility, operating in a changing system, with pressures that continued to evolve. And as we move forward in this story, we'll see that the events of 1987 were not the end of the challenges inside this prison. In some ways, they were only the beginning. A facility aging in a modern system. More than a century after it first opened, USP Atlanta is still in operation, but the system around it has changed dramatically. Modern federal prisons are often designed with updated surveillance systems, improved layouts, and infrastructure built for today's correctional standards. USP Atlanta, by contrast, was built in 1902, and while renovations and repairs have been carried out over the years, the core structure remains old. That age presents ongoing challenges, maintenance issues, outdated design features, and limitations that newer facilities simply don't face. Reports from oversight bodies, including the Department of Justice's Office of the Inspector General, have repeatedly highlighted concerns across aging federal institutions, including infrastructure deterioration and the cost of maintaining older prisons. It's important to note that not all issues are unique to Atlanta, but in a facility this old, those challenges can become more visible and more difficult to manage over time. Because a prison is not just a building, it's an environment that must function under constant pressure. And when that environment begins to wear down, everything inside it feels the impact. Staffing shortages and operational strain. In recent years, one of the most widely reported issues across the federal prison system has been staffing shortages. USP Atlanta has not been exempt from this trend. According to multiple oversight reports and news investigations, shortages of correctional officers have affected operations in several federal facilities. When staffing levels drop, the impact is immediate. Fewer officers are available to supervise inmates. Response times may increase, and remaining staff are often required to work extended hours. This can lead to fatigue, and in a high-security environment, fatigue carries risk. To compensate, some facilities have reassigned non-custodial staff, such as administrative personnel, to perform correctional duties. While this helps maintain basic operations, it also raises concerns about training and preparedness. Officials have acknowledged these challenges. Efforts have been made to recruit and retain staff, but the issue has not been resolved quickly. And inside a place like USP Atlanta, even small gaps in staffing can have significant consequences. Conditions inside. What reports say. Conditions inside USP Atlanta have been the subject of various reports and investigations over the years. It's important to approach this carefully, because conditions in prisons can vary over time, and not all reports describe the same experiences. However, several consistent themes have emerged in official findings and credible reporting. These include concerns about overcrowding in certain periods, delays in medical care, maintenance and sanitation issues, and the broader impact of staffing shortages on daily operations. The Department of Justice's Inspector General has documented systemic challenges across multiple Bureau of Prisons facilities, including access to healthcare and infrastructure limitations. In some cases, advocacy groups and legal filings have raised additional concerns. But not all claims are independently verified. So it's critical to distinguish between confirmed findings and allegations. What is clear is that maintaining consistent conditions in an aging, high-security prison is complex. And when multiple challenges intersect, infrastructure, staffing, population management, the system becomes harder to stabilize. Violence and safety concerns. Like many high-security prisons, USP Atlanta has experienced incidents of violence. These can include inmate-on-inmate assaults, and, in some cases, assaults involving staff. Exact numbers vary by year, and not all incidents are publicly detailed. However, federal data confirms that violent incidents do occur across the Bureau of Prisons system, particularly in high-security facilities. It's important to avoid exaggeration here. USP Atlanta is not uniquely violent compared to all other federal prisons, but it does operate in a category where risk levels are inherently higher. Factors that contribute to this include the type of offenders housed, population density, staffing levels, and institutional conditions. When these factors align in certain ways, the likelihood of incidents increases, and managing that risk is a constant priority for prison officials. The role of USP Atlanta today. Today, USP Atlanta continues to function as part of the federal prison system. Its role has evolved over time. While it remains a high-security facility, it has also been used for specific population management purposes, including housing certain categories of inmates based on system needs. The Bureau of Prisons regularly adjusts how inmates are distributed across facilities. These decisions are influenced by security classifications, available space, and operational considerations. USP Atlanta's long history makes it a flexible, though complex, part of that system. It is not the newest. It is not the most technologically advanced, but it remains active, and its continued operation reflects both necessity and the challenges of replacing large, historic institutions. A prison defined by its history. More than 120 years after it opened, USP Atlanta carries a history that few institutions can match. It has witnessed the early formation of the federal prison system, decades of policy changes, periods of overcrowding and reform, and one of the most significant prison uprisings in modern U.S. history. Each of those moments has left a mark, not just on the facility, but on how it is perceived. Because prisons are not static places. They evolve. They reflect the systems that create them, and they reveal the pressures within those systems. USP Atlanta is no exception. Its story is not defined by a single event, but by the accumulation of many. USP Atlanta is not the most modern prison. It's not the most isolated, and it's not the most technologically advanced, but it is one of the most historically significant. Its story reveals something larger than a single institution. It shows how prisons change over time, how policies shape environments, and how pressure, when left unaddressed, can lead to critical moments. From its opening in 1902, to the unrest of 1987, to the ongoing challenges of today, USP Atlanta reflects both the strengths and the limitations of the system it belongs to. And perhaps that's what makes it important, not just as a place, but as a case study. Because understanding what happens inside prisons like this helps explain how the system itself works and where it struggles. If you found this breakdown insightful, make sure to like the video and subscribe to Life Behind Bars for more real, in-depth prison documentaries. No exaggeration, no fiction, just facts. And if there's a prison you want us to explore next, drop it in the comments.